So many of you gamers out there know that anti-aliasing, or MSAA for short, is a very taxing additive to almost any game that you can possibly play on your personal computer. Now, I may get grilled in the comments for what I'm about to say next, only because it's a very, very generalization. But for those of you who don't know what anti-aliasing is, imagine a sphere made out of squares. Those squares are the pixels in your screens. And they're going to look a little jagged. They're not going to look very smooth. What anti-aliasing attempts to do is smooth out those surfaces by dimming some pixels around the edges of those spheres and other curved surfaces in your games. That's as much as I'm going to say about anti-aliasing. There are plenty of videos on YouTube describing anti-aliasing in much more detail. That's really out of the scope of this video. Disclaimer right up front, you do not need anti-aliasing to run any game of your choosing. Anti-aliasing is just an added feature. It's something that would be nice to have if you could afford it. And what I mean by afford it is, well, you're going to need a pretty pricey graphics card to be able to run anti-aliasing in any game whatsoever. I mean, an R7 370 it's pretty much going to cut your FPS in half. An R9 380 or GTX 960, it could do it. But if you're playing at anything other than 1080p, don't expect to get anywhere above ×2 anti-aliasing. So, the solution I have for you, if you're willing to spend an extra 100 or so US dollars, is the GTX 970. Now, the R9 390 would also be a great candidate in this case. However, in my particular case, I was worried about power. I only have a 600 watt bronze in here, and I'm overclocking my 4690K to 4.4 gigahertz. So the power curve issue was there. I wanted to stay within the peak efficiency curve of my power supply. And on top of that, it does run a bit hotter than the GTX 970 on average, but for the sake of preventing any potentially hazardous arguments from taking place in the comments below, you definitely could substitute the GTX 970 for an R9 390 and experience about a 5 to 10 FPS boost in games. So the one game that we chose in this benchmark was GTA 5, not only because we could adjust the anti-aliasing multiplier, but also because we could see how anti-aliasing affected different presets within the game, because we could change a lot of individual settings to see how all of those were affected by the increase in anti-aliasing with respect to the frame per second rate. So our control test was just setting everything to high without any anti-aliasing on whatsoever. This includes FXAA, ambient occlusion, and shadows being set to soft. Additionally, no advanced graphics settings were touched at all. Those were all turned off or set to 0. And the average frame rate that we received from this first test was about 127. Now, if you've seen some of my previous videos about the GTX 960, you're probably thinking, well, hey, the GTX 960 was getting about 115, 120 FPS. That's literally just barely under what our 970 is getting, and this 970 costs $100 more. Well, yes, and those were set at the exact same preset, so really, apples to apples, you're only getting about a 10 FPS boost with an extra $100 cost. But where things start to change is when you start adding things on in the game. So when you start increasing resolutions, when you start increasing the anti-aliasing level, the multiplier there, or when you start tinkering with the advanced graphics settings, the GTX 960 experiences a severe dip in FPS, whereas the 970 experiences a more shallow decline. So that's what you're about to see. The next set of tests included everything being the same as it was in the first set, except turning up our anti-aliasing multiplier to ×2. And the FPS that we received in this set of tests was 104. Now I should note that when we did the exact same thing with our 960, having everything on high and then just adjusting our anti-aliasing multiplier to ×2, our FPS was cut from about 115 to 74. So literally almost a 50% dip in FPS only because of 2 times anti-aliasing. That's a big cut for a 960. That's a big cut for any graphics card. But in the case of our 970, a cut from 127 to 104 is less than 20%. So it definitely stood its ground much better than the 960 did. And this is where you're going to see your money start to make sense. How much more you paid for this 970 versus 960 is when you start turning up these settings. The next set of tests was keeping everything exactly the same again, but moving from ×2 anti-aliasing to ×4. And this time our FPS rate decreased, of course it decreased, but it decreased to 94. Doubling the anti-aliasing multiplier again from ×2 to ×4 only decreased our average FPS rate by 10. So literally just under 10% cut from ×2 to ×4. In the same regard, our GTX 960 received an FPS cut from the mid-70s to about 44 FPS. So again, a near 50% cut in frame rate from a simple doubling of the anti-aliasing multiplier. things aren't looking too good for our 960, but our 970 is definitely holding up. So let's push it to the limit. GTA 5 only allows us to go to ×8 anti-aliasing, so that's what we did with the next set of tests. And with ×8 anti-aliasing and everything else being set to high as it was originally, our FPS rate average was 81. So again, only about a 10% cut from doubling the anti-aliasing multiplier. It's pretty incredible. Most cards by this point would not even run. In fact, our GTX 960 only produced 22 FPS in this run, so this one was literally cut in half from 44 to 22. Keep in mind this is at 1080p and everything else set to high. So our GTX 960 was pretty much done for. There was no point in going any further with these tests with that card in particular because 22 FPS is just not playable unless you're into super choppy gameplay, which would be crazy. But as for our GTX 970, things were definitely playable still. 81 FPS is superb for having ×8 anti-aliasing on. But how much further can we push our additional settings on top of that ×8 anti-aliasing multiplier and still stay within the bounds of about 60 FPS, which I would deem playable? Let's see how far this rabbit hole goes. That was a Matrix reference. The Matrix. You guys seen the Matrix? Tell me you've seen the Matrix. You've seen the Matrix, right? We literally took every setting that we could on the standard graphics tab of GTA 5 and maxed everything out. Everything was turned onto either very high for the highest preset or ultra for that highest preset. We also had FXAA on, we had ambient occlusion on, we had everything turned up all the way, including motion blur, maxed out. Everything you could think of in the standard graphics tab was turned up all the way, and we still achieved 62 FPS in GTA 5 gameplay. So the very last test we could run was maxing out all the advanced tabs as well, so turning up distance scaling to max, turning on long shadows, high resolution shadows I think was in there, a few other things. So with the advanced graphics turned on and or all the way up, and compensating for a few things like ambient occlusion, FXAA, and MSAA reflections, things like that we had to counteract that additional VRAM with to make sure that we stayed below the 3.5 gig boundary. You don't want to pass that boundary. You don't want to do it in GTX 970. We received a frame rate of 54. 54 FPS with as much as we could possibly max out on our card, including ×8 anti-aliasing. 54 is pretty darn playable. For a $300 card, expect to max out pretty much any game at 1080p, and I would say 60 to 70% of most games in ultra-wide or maybe even 1440p gaming. Also, I have white DDR3 in my rig now, no longer that red DDR3 that I had before. It is a bit slower at 1866 MHz, but I don't really care. I'm more of an aesthetics person. As long as the thing functions mostly the same, I'm okay with that. It just looks pretty darn cool. Keep in mind that if you have any questions, you can leave those in the comments below, or you can hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. Be sure to post on our wall if you have any questions about any rig you plan on putting together. Be sure to check out Instagram for cool pictures about things that I'm building and doing here in the studio, and just chat with me on Twitter. That's pretty much that's what I like to do on Twitter, just chat with people. If you liked what you saw in this video, give us a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, give me a thumbs down and let me know why you didn't like it. Also, subscribe to us for more if you haven't already, because we post content like this all the time, because we are Science Studio and we have to do science stuff to, stay true to our name. This is Science Studio. Thanks for learning with us.